architects were to bring a building's form back to the presumed origin in nature, Didascalo argues, they would be forced to do away with walls, columns, pilasters, friezes, cornices, vaults, even roofs. Their building would vanish altogether. Didascalo claims that the art of building did not originate from the rational imitation of rustic dwellings, nor its ornamental forms emerged from construction technique. Architects never followed rules in their designs, and the ornaments they employed have always been irrational and strange. The fantastic compositions for facades Piranesi included at the end of the parere eloquently illustrates Didascalo's contention. Richly encrusted with ornament, these heterogeneous collages of fanciful columns, intricate moldings, enigmatic bas-reliefs are certainly among the strangest architectural compositions ever to come out of Piranesi's imagination. In spite of its polemical intent and caricatural tone, the parere captures accurately, if in very broad strokes, the range of positions 18th century authors adopted in the matter of ornament. On the one hand, the rationalists and traditionalists, represented by Protopiro, sought guidelines for ornamenting architectural forms in the doctrine of imitation. Protopiro's adherents held that these guidelines were to be found through a critical emulation of the best models from antiquity and a reasoned analysis of the wooden originals described by Vitruvius, who explained the origins of the Doric and Ionic entablatures in wood construction. So this is actually an illustration by John Sohn from a Piranesi print. If you're familiar with this whole debate, there's been, Vitruvius has been really looked at carefully to figure out how does the Doric order in marble take its shape, and the argument would be that it's from the imitation of nature, like painting would imitate nature. But in case of architecture, obviously, because it's abstract, you cannot imitate pure nature, so you have to imitate a rustic dwelling made by man who are almost animals. So that would be the argument. So you'll see an enormous amount of literature and images trying to figure out how the various components of the Doric, say, frieze, emerge from specificities of construction. While the traditionalists admitted that reason alone might not entirely account for all forms, they maintained that decorum, the appropriateness of a building's aspect to its intended use, at least provided the principles necessary for designers to avoid indiscriminate use of ornament. Conservative theorists that sought to reduce ornament to a supporting role in architectural expression, a role confined to within the strict boundaries of decorum. They neutralize the potential excess of ornament into orderly decoration. On the other hand, the proponents of invention, personified by Didascalo, not only challenge the ornamentation by decorum, they also question architects' imagination, integrate into architectural practice, an expanded canon of forms beyond selected models from the Greco-Roman past that authorities dismissed. They also desire to overcome the rationalists' tectonic bias that prescribe that all forms must find their logic in the built original. Looking outside the strict confines of the art of building, they found inspiration in the adornment of interiors and objects. By high pleasure, ultimately mind and body, ornament both focused on Enlightenment thinking about the visual arts and grounded in the nascent discipline of aesthetics. While Enlightenment thinkers on ornament drew upon traditional critical categories developed by earlier theorists of the visual and poetic arts, they also responded to the accelerated modernization of European societies. Consolidation of the bourgeoisie's political power, coupled with a gradual decline of absolutist models of kinship, challenged the role ornament had played then. Ornament's purpose was individual rank structures, a function reflected in the etymology in the Latin orn, and ordinare, to put in order, lost its traction as the burgeoning of capitalism blurred the formerly sharp contours of the social orders. Cities, the primary sites of early market economies, orchestrated the expansion of the monetarized exchange of goods that bore ornamental and other visual signs. Others have ornament, best exemplified in that quintessential modern medium, the reproductive print, undermined its usefulness as a stable marker of privilege. The deterioration of ornament valence in the bourgeois public sphere ultimately resulted in Adolf Loos's claim of its irrelevance for the 20th century, as suggested by the title of his well-known 1910 essay, Ornament and Crime. Paradoxically, perhaps a newfound depth compensated for the decline of ornament's usefulness as a social emblem. The bourgeois ideal of sensitive individuality and the importance it placed on aesthetic experience carved out a quasi-metaphysical role for beauty. In the Critique of Judgment of 1790, Kant used ornament as the perfect example of free beauty, separated from any contingent human interests, including the long-standing political use of ornament to convey regal splendor. As free beauty, ornament shed its role as a superficial marker of prestige to become the object of aesthetic experience. The coarse repository of traditional forms or herald of invention, public sign of social status or private object of aesthetic contemplation, the wide range of meanings 18th century theorists projected onto ornament derive from their understanding of its additive character. The 17th century French writer and translator of Vitruvius, Claude Perrault, provided a synthetic definition of the modern's conception. For Perrault, ornament in architecture was, and I quote, all things that are not essential components, but that are added on only to enrich and embellish the work, such as sculpted leaves, flowers, geometric motifs that one carves into moldings on friezes and on coffers and in other places that one wants to adorn. So you notice here that basically in architectural theory, moldings, which make up the orders, are not considered ornamental. It's only in this case with Perrault, the actual figurative elements in them. So these are moldings, obviously. The flowers that you see are the ornamental aspects, but not the actual shape of the molding. As Perrault himself remarked, this has not been Vitruvius' view. Pierre Gros has pointed out how, unlike most more recent authors, Vitruvius used the term ornamenta to designate the three parts of the entablature, the architrave, the frieze, and the cornice. As the horizontal components of trabeation, Vitruvian ornament played a fundamental role, at once semiotic and tectonic, in the design of temples, the supreme instance of the art of building, according to the Roman writer. For Vitruvius, the forms of ornamenta did more than announce the god to whom the temple was dedicated. Without ornamenta, the temple, reduced to a mass of columns, would simply not exist. Vitruvius's definition of ornament, so different from the 18th century view of it as accessory, persisted well into the Renaissance. In codifying the architectural orders, Giacomo Parozzi da Vignola's immensely popular manual Regola degli Cinque Ordini d'Architettura still referred to the constituent components of the orders and not the motifs carved on them as ornamenti. So here's Vignola. This is the absolute bestseller of architectural theory. It's actually a book that has very little theory in it, but it has all the rules to design the orders. And it's fascinating that at this late date, he still uses ornamenta to talk about the entablature, not the actual sculpture on the pieces. While Vitruvius' original definition still resonated in Renaissance thinking, John Onions has located the initial split between ornament and a building's more fundamental qualities a century before Vignola in the writings of Leon Battista Alberti. In the De Re Edificatoria, written in the mid-15th century, that humanists define ornament as, and I quote, a form of auxiliary light and complement to beauty. From this, it follows, I believe, that beauty is some inherent property to be found suffused all through the body of the work, which may be called beautiful, whereas ornamentum, rather than being inherent, has the character of something attached or additional. So this clearly is the start of what we think the ornamental is, which is actually a detachable object from the actual work, which in Albertian thinking would be beautiful by its proportions, not necessarily by its ornamentation. To be sure, as Caroline de Nijck and Alina Payne have noted, Alberti's ornamentum was far less restrictive a concept than the one proposed by Perrault. For Alberti, ornamentum, unlike what came after it, comprised all phenomenal manifestations of the building's beauty, the latter determined by the abstract operations of lineaments and their role in concinitas, the harmonious relationship among a design's part. Yet Alberti's ornamentum, despite its comprehensive definition, was soon misconstrued to imply a separation between the appearance of buildings and some more authentic, invisible principles that begot true beauty. Misreadings of Alberti's distinction led to the much narrower 18th century conception of ornament. This ultimately resulted in the divide between a building's structure and its envelope, implemented at the end of the 19th century in actual buildings with the advent of large steel frame construction. So we have to make sure not to misinterpret Alberti. He's not telling us that actually the modernity is really ornament on one side and then the building on the other. Yet this division, which does not exist in Alberti, would really be pushed in the 17th, 18th century. So for Alberti, for instance, the ornament is actually the physical manifestation of the building. If the building's essence is its geometry and proportions, the ornamental is actually the stuff of the buildings. That's what, that's what makes us perceive the building as a building. Using this knowledge of ancient rhetoric and poetics, Alberti could focus his architectural discourse on the role ornament played in endowing a building with decor. Vitruvius had identified decor as one of the fundamental principles of the art of building. So decorum, is always a category that has to do with the role that form plays in society. He held that decor was bound by three imperatives: statio, consuetudine, and natura. To conform to statio, the external appropriateness of an architectural form to its destination, the forms of a temple should, for example, suit its dedicatory god. The temple to Jupiter should not have a roof, for instance. Similarly, the architectural orders, from the solid Doric to the slender Corinthian, should correspond to the strength or delicacy of a given divinity. Second, respect for consuetudine, or custom, required decor to attend to the internal logic of a building's forms. Vitruvius advised that a splendidly decorated house should not have a simple facade, any more than distinctive attributes of the architectural orders could not be mixed. Dentils must not appear in a Doric frieze, or triglyphs in an Ionic one. Finally, to conform to natura, the natural order of the world, decor must ensure that the building site was suited to its purpose. Vitruvius stated, for instance, that a sanctuary to Aesculapius, the god of healing, should be situated in a salubrious location. The natural causes of decor also determine a building's orientation according to its internal distribution. They ensure, Vitruvius points out, that bedrooms faced east to receive the morning light and that picture galleries pointed north to benefit from even illumination. So it's a complicated sort of a mishmash of concepts. Vitruvius, actually, if you've ever read Vitruvius, is very difficult to understand what he's talking about sometimes. So the decor here really has specifically talking about the relationship of the form to the gods. That's his main interest. And that's where you get the gendered theory of the orders, that Doric is a male order, should be used for male gods, Corinthian is a feminine order, should be used for Vestals or virgins, etc. So that's sort of a trope that you find in Vitruvius. But also this idea that the decor needs to be a consistent use of the ornaments. That basically, if you are a king, your palace needs to be spectacularly ornamented, because that's your social status. And you cannot have contrasts. You cannot have a very richly decorated house with a very simple facade, for instance. So you can see very clearly the relationship between that and fashion. Where obviously, if you have to maintain your status through the garments, and you have to proclaim your status in the public. So completely different from us, obviously, because there's probably no way you can tell if somebody's extremely wealthy if they wear jeans, right? So there's no sign. Well, mind you, it's a bit more complicated, right? Jeans are complicated. Anyways. Alberti reinterpreted the first two imperatives of Vitruvian decor by reading the Roman theorists with an eye to ancient authors on ethics and rhetoric. Echoing Vitruvian statio, Alberti maintained that to comply with what we may call external decorum, that would be the public representation, a building's form should coincide with the prestige of the program and its patron. Guardian of architecture's social role, external decorum corresponded to the ethical prescription outlined notably by Cicero in the Offices, which stressed that the actions and dress of individuals should conform to their social stature. So this is very interesting, that basically it's not only a prescription for architectural form, but it also has to do with ethics. That, say, the politician, according to Cicero, needs to have a dignified demeanor in public, the same way a building, which would be, say, a parliament house, should have a dignified relationship in public. It cannot be a simple building. External decorum thus regulated the outward display of ornament. Alberti also adhered to Vitruvius's consuetudino, governing the second imperative of decor, which may be designated as internal decorum. It presided over the correspondence of ornamental forms within a particular composition. Alberti discussed internal decorum under compartitio, one of the 6 aspects of building. It determined the subdivisions of site and buildings into close-fitting smaller units joined together like members of the whole body. Alberti wrote. He emphasized that in order to maintain internal decorum, none of the building's parts should be more adorned than the others, so that the harmony is such that the building appears a single, integral, and well-composed body, rather than a collection of extraneous and unrelated parts. Like orators in their speeches, Albertian architects needed to abide by internal and external decorum to achieve not only a coherent, but also socially appropriate style in their design. For Alberti, only orators and architects instructed in decorum could generate the effective forms essential to fulfill the social role of their respective arts. So this is where rhetoric is the major architectural theory, if you like, or visual theory in general, in a post-classical world. So this stems from Aristotle, this idea that you should create a work, specifically in this case a piece of clay, as a coherent whole in which all the parts are related. And the ornament of the various parts, that is, in the case of theaters, speech, needs to be appropriate to the character. So a prince cannot speak in vulgar terms. A peasant cannot speak like a prince. And that analogy then regulates architecture. So basically, all the pieces need to fit properly. None of them can be more ornamented than the other. If you are to create a work of architecture which is effective in public. Architecture is always considered in that light as a public art. So there's no real domestic architecture in that sense. There's only domesticity of palaces, or buildings which have a social balance. Enlightenment theorists retain only the most modern aspect of Alberti's consideration of ornament, which they interpreted as a supplement. 18th century traditionalists such as Jean-François Bédard even pushed ornament firmly outside the strict disciplinary concern of architecture. For Blondel, whose monumental Cours d'Architecture stands as a veritable summa of the century's doctrine, ornament was the province not of architecture but of sculpture. Blondel argued that unlike ornament, the architectural orders and their moldings were never mere enhancements. They function as repositories of an architectural beauty rooted in geometry and proportion. So here's the beginning of the divide, that basically ornament is not essential to architecture. It really has to do with architectural sculpture. And the moldings of the orders are not ornamental because they sort of crystallize a tradition of Greco-Roman building which is rooted in nature. So it's a very convoluted argument that actually part around molding is something natural, but that's the way they would actually claim it would be. But if you started decorating the part around with, say, leaves, then that would be ornamental and that would be really sculpture. So for Blondel, ultimately, you don't really absolutely need ornament to have a building, but you do need it for the external decor. If Versailles was simple, it wouldn't work as a chateau. It wouldn't work as a palace. It cannot be simple. He noted that architects could nonetheless rely on sculpteurs ornementistes, as he called sculptors who did not specialize in statuary, for figurative or abstract motifs sanctioned by tradition to enrich the order's profiles. So this is the plate I showed before. So in this case, you can use those ornamental forms on the moldings, all the different types, but you have to be extremely judicious. You cannot use them all at all times in the same composition, because then the utterance is too rich. And also you have to make sure that the ornaments you include on those moldings really correspond to the speech you're trying to do in public of the architecture. Architects wanting to make those part of a composition already decorated with orders more resplendent could, he stated, also add subordinate sculptural elements such as urns, vases, statues, and bas-reliefs. Blondel considers ornament to be merely additive and at best an enrichment to the more essential mathematical beauties of architecture, at worst a brilliant cloak woven to mask an architect's want of taste. By relegating ornament to a marginal role, Blondel wished to prevent it from disrupting the system of architectural meaning he founded on truth, vérité, and verisimilitude, vraisemblance. So this also comes actually from Aristotelian theories of theater, the idea of truth, which would be the domain of, say, philosophy. But vraisemblance, verisimilitude, which is even more interesting, it's the appearance of truth. In a tradition of earlier consideration on architectural form inspired by rhetoric inaugurated by Alberti, decorated buildings were true, Blondel argued, when architects respected the same decorum in ornamental matters as they sought in other aspects of their design. So truth comes from decorum, as we might now understand that the system is circular. Beauty stems from decorum, decorum produces beauty. Like his Renaissance forerunners, he advocated a precise match between a building's forms and intended purpose, a form that encompassed both its utilitarian function and the outward expression of its patron's social standing. He also made a case for the coherence of the composition decorative forms. Architects needed first to select the appropriate order for a particular composition. Blondel prescribed, the order would provide the expressive basis that guided all degrees of ornamental embellishments from simplicity to moderation to richness. Paramount for Blondel was the unity of a building's character, implied by a given order, for only a caractère décidé, a precise character, led to truth in building. So this idea of character is also quite interesting. It also comes from the theory of the theater, of poetry, that basically each person, each character in a play needs to be typified to be understood as such. So a prince need to behave like a prince. So for Blondel, buildings also need to have a decided character. If it's a church, it needs to be immediate that you will know it's a church. And of course, in the case of Vitruvius, you need to know immediately that it's a temple of Jupiter because of the orders you're using. However, Blondel admitted that architects could not always achieve truth in their design. Consideration of local custom and the patron's whims, the imperative visual pleasure afforded by variety and contrast, even the contingency of particular commissions, such as the renovation of an existing building, often prevented the implementation of the essential components of architectural truth. If unable to attain this goal, architects could nonetheless rely on verisimilitude, vraisemblance. Unlike truth, verisimilitude took into account the compromises architects routinely faced in construction. Guided by verisimilitude, they could manipulate an order's proportions through optical correction, choose simulated materials when genuine ones were not available, or even adapt canonical forms to reflect local customs. If architects could not implement the strict principles of truth, Blondel believed they must then embrace verisimilitude in order to give the building the appearance of truth. That's always been a major issue in Vitruvian theory. That basically, if you read Vitruvius, the idea is that the truth or the meaning of orders and of architecture stems from their proportional relationships. Yet, even in Vitruvius, there's an acknowledgement that perception, human perception, is not perfect, and I won't be able to understand that the Doric column is 1 in 7 proportion. So it's that sort of massaging of truth, massaging of mathematics, which is the vraisemblance. So it's not truth per se, but it makes it more truthful because we perceive it as such to be truthful. So it's a bit like propaganda. Makes things seem more true than they are, but actually they're not. Ornament held a key role in bringing that apparent truth. The intrinsic variety of ornaments had always been questionable, Blondel conceded. Unlike the orders and their moldings, sculpted motifs did not originate in a natural order improved by mathematics, and their presence was never essential to architecture. But with verisimilitude as guide, ornaments, as Blondel believed, conjure a special charm that focused the viewer's attention. Alberti had observed a similar spellbinding effect resulting from extravagant form. Describing fanciful capitals, Alberti warned architects against forgetting the requisite congenitas in their assemblies, that is, the proportion. However, he acknowledged that outlandish forms had the power to entertain the viewer with a charming trick, or better still, to please him by the wit of his invention. Similarly, for Blondel, ornament could forego the proper rules of architectural beauty to heighten a building's effect on viewers, the more so since ornaments were mere accessories to this more fundamental quality. So here's sort of the trajectory from Alberti that says that the ornamental is the physical manifestation of mathematics. In the case of Blondel, this is a given already, the separation is a given, but Blondel concedes that architects must break rules because their main task is to make their buildings speak in public, make them interesting to the public. If the buildings are dull and they don't perform, then they might have the most beautiful proportions in the world. They do not function as they should, as a social art. So it's a strange, on the one hand you have there's always this phrase of the purity of mathematics as a source of all beauty. On the other, there's a real acknowledgement that you need to massage and make that more palatable to make the building really work. So you see right there that once mathematics become less important as a source of beauty, then ornament can be completely free because it has to do with the viewer perception. With his two-tiered system of architectural value organized on vérité and vraisemblance, Blondel accommodated custom's appeal to viewers within the seemingly inflexible rules of architecture. Custom affected some domains of architectural practice more than others, he recognized, particularly the ephemeral forms that more closely fitted fluctuating social rituals. Such were interiors, decoration, garden architecture, temporary structures for festivals and the theater, and I would claim also fashion. But these were subordinate to architecture's public mission, which predicated a dignified permanence in the form of a timeless monumentality. So that's really, it really stems on the basis of the public rhetoric, say of Cicero, that the statesmen need to be, the virtue of the statesman needs to be eternal. The good deeds need to be eternal. Such also should be temples and churches, etc. Like ornament, these more whimsical practices remain on the periphery of properly architectural concerns. In these areas, architects could relax the restriction that decorum and verisimilitude normally impose on ornamentation. Blondel nonetheless suggested carrying onto interiors the decorative principles he promoted for exteriors. In both cases, he recommended that architects emphasize the geometric regularity of the principal components of a design. Architects could easily fix a building's character by relating its parts to the formal logic of a given architectural order. The interiors in buildings are never really theorized clearly, because essentially architecture, because of its public function and because of the reliance on mathematics, the interior decoration is really of little interest for the theorists, but of course for the users it's probably the most important thing, especially in 18th century France. So there's an understanding that you need to accommodate whimsical decoration for the purpose of the function of those interiors. So when he said that we should take, say, the orders of the outside of the building and put them inside, he's being facetious, because that's something you probably never do. Since the orders really need to be sort of the public mass of the building, but they're not supposed to be the internal mass of the building. And that's where you have a tension then between invention and imitation. That would be sort of the big divide. Imitation has to do with grounding in nature and architecture as a public art. Invention has to do with private consumption of ornamental forms for pleasure, pure pleasure. So interiors, for instance, dress, domestic objects, etc. Published in the distribution de la distribution des maisons de plaisance of 1737, Blondel's earlier pronouncement on interior design had been equally uncompromising. In it, as in the Cours, he repeatedly stressed the importance of male simplicity in interior decoration and the imperative of a room's overall architectural organization commanding its ornamentation. Yet Blondel had illustrated de la distribution with fanciful Rococo designs that undermined his call for restraint and regularity. This inconsistency revealed the need for even the most traditional of theorists, those most committed to upholding precedent and decorum, to embrace the sway of custom and fashion in architectural matters. Blondel's compromise, no doubt, reflected the importance of interior decoration and the decorative arts in the Parisian luxury trade. 18th century Paris set the tone on fashionable elegance in dress, as well as in decor, furniture, domestic objects for the whole of Europe. The author's concession also revealed the ambiguous role interiors had played in architectural theory since its origin. So one of the fascinating things when you actually read these treatises is they're completely schizophrenic. You read on the one side, we should imitate primitive hut, the virtue of the triangle, the golden ratio, and then suddenly models for Rococo decoration on the other side, which of course has no geometric basis at all. It can be anything, which is excessive, but he has to, in a way, it's reciting the Bible and then providing images that have nothing to do with it. Already in the 7th book of De Architectura, Vitruvius had grown weary of contemporary fresco decors. He attacked the grotesque decorations that had replaced in Roman interiors the simulated depictions of materials, illusionistic landscapes, and mythological scenes. Vitruvius deplored that a mixture of plans animals, human forms, which resulted in monstrous compositions that eluded the laws of gravity. So here I'm showing you an example of a grotesque decor from Roman times. If he decried their makers for not depicting objects found in reality, he also censored their sponsors for applauding their purely imaginary inventions. Unintentionally, Vitruvius's criticism located the most fertile site for formal invention in interior decoration. In interiors, designers could pursue endless variety by freeing ornament from the fetters of verisimilitude and decorum. Vitruvius's tirade succeeded in linking irrational decors with visual pleasure. So this is probably, you would probably not reconsider having said that in chapter 7, by saying that these decors were shameful, were irrational, had no gravity. Basically, they don't have the main characteristics of buildings, which is to be standing on the ground. They have no mathematical proportions. They are fanciful. These are all non-architectural qualities. But of course, they are primary decorative qualities, and this led later architects, specifically later decorators, to focus on the grotesque as the main site where they could invent. Unlike inventions that derived from imitation and complied with decorum, grotesque compositions exhibited the extreme formal variety that generated a wide range of responses from the viewers, from festive to horrified. Piranesi suggested that designers of grotesques could even consider exotic forms beyond the Greco-Roman antiquity to achieve their effects. Indeed, despite their origins in ancient Rome, such decors were first discovered during the excavation of Nero's Domus Aurea in the 1480s and widely imitated thereafter. Grotesques hardly aligned with Greco-Roman formulations of beauty. Unlike the orders, grotesque forms displayed no geometrical regularity, nor were their parts related by fixed proportion. They did not exhibit canonical motifs sanctioned by imitation, nor did verisimilitude guide their assembly. Without concern for appropriateness, painters of grotesques freely combined elements copied from art and nature with those from pure imagination. Varietas, variety, and inventio, invention, guided their art as it did the orders and the poets. A creative strategy that transcended specific media, the grotesque was not limited to the painted walls of rooms or to the inlaid surfaces of furniture and objects. Renaissance designers had in fact used grotesques, ornamental mélange, frequently in their design of the orders themselves. Even after Vignola's codification, they emulated the antique columns and entablatures whose mixed forms did not fit the canon. These they defined generally as composite. Composite capitals and entablatures were particularly prevalent on triumphal arches, a building type Vitruvius failed to discuss. However, as Alina Payne has remarked, triumphal arches provided the most elaborate example of ornamental treatment to be found among Roman antiquities. The composite order secured its prestige as a model to the association with the political power expressed in triumphal arches. It sanctioned amalgams of forms despite the Vitruvian imperative of consuetudine. So the composite capital is outside of the canon. It's not a Corinthian capital. It's not a Ionic capital. So you see, for instance, in this case, with the horse, this wants to be a Corinthian capital, but suddenly there's a horse stemming from it. So it's obviously not canonical in any way. Theorists in the Renaissance and after really had a lot of problems looking at Vitruvius and following the rules of Vitruvius and actually looking at actual Roman buildings and finding that for all the strictures about what a Corinthian capital should look like, actual capitals were like this. And what I'm claiming, this is a grotesque strategy of form, meaning that it really has to do with the collage of the elements within an overall canvas, as opposed to a pure imitation of nature. Blondet's reluctant acceptance of custom in architecture paralleled the progressive expansion in the course of the 18th century of the range of accepted ornamental forms available to European architects. Johann Fischer von Erlach in his Entwurf einer historischen Architektur of 1721, embraced the complete relativity of national tastes. He asserted that, quote, customs may indeed authorize certain whims in the art of building, such as the trivial and superfluous ornaments of carving in the Gothic building on steeples, Indian roofs, and the like. Since nations dissent no less in their taste for architecture than in food and raiment. However, Fischer stressed that buildings from all cultures derive from their work from general principles such as symmetry and apparent stability, universal qualities in good architecture. To his brief introduction, Fischer appended 86 plates that brought the 7 wonders of the ancient world in non-European buildings such as the Blue Mosque in Istanbul and the Porcelain Pagoda in Nanjing, together with building designs of his own creation. Thus, he furnished with a visual encyclopedia artists could, by comparing one's nation face with the other, themselves make the judicious choice. For the first time in architectural theory, an author submitted the diversity of world architecture, until then only an object of curiosity for lovers of travel literature, to the scrutiny of designers. Fischer vividly illustrated the combinatory and the grotesque process his continuum enabled after documenting ancient Egyptian, Roman, and Greek vases from various collections. He generated his own fantastic composition inspired by these antique originals. It's an incredible revolution that in 1721 an architectural theorist would tell you that the Chinese building is beautiful. Because imitation, the theory of imitation, stresses that only Greco-Roman forms really stand for nature. None of the other architectural styles, Gothic or, say, Indian architecture, in their mind, of course, is natural. So it's always monstrous. But in the case of Fischer, clearly the variety of the form is the value. So vase designs is also quite interesting as a discipline because architects design a lot of vases. It's not codified in any way. The general shapes can imitate Greco-Roman vases, but the ornamentation itself is absolutely open. So it's a bit like Grotesque core in that sense. In his critique of judgment, Kant asserted that it was unnecessary for humans to know the purpose of flowers, birds, and shells to appreciate their beauty. It is ironic that for man-made example of free beauty, he chose the least meaningless forms of ornament. His first example, designs à la grecque, Zeichnungen à la grecque, had played a key role in the mid-18th century debate over the reform of the decorative arts. Kant was referring to frets, a band pattern formed by intersecting straight lines, which architectural theorists have traditionally recommended for the enhancement of the flat surfaces of building profiles. Because of their rigid geometry and association with antiquity, anti-Rococo reformists had advocated regular architectural motifs like frets to order the unruly, curvilinear, chimerical interiors born out of the grotesque imagination. So here I'm showing you the funny spoof on Goût grec, on the Greek taste that Petitot drew. So in Kant, and that's it's really a real irony that basically using frets, geometric motifs that you find in Greek architecture, as an example of a completely free beauty, Kant contextualizes entirely the meaning of those frets. And meanings of frets is actually extraordinarily pointed in the late 18th century. For instance, in this desk designed for la Livre de Julie, which is a Goût grec, neo-Grec design, there's a very pointed effort to use architectural ornament in interior furniture. And that's something that usually was not done traditionally. There was no relationship, say, in the early 18th century between a temple and a table. But you'll find in Bercy, of course, a different attitude. So the frets here, for instance, here very clearly it's a herald against the excess of the rocaille, the excess of the grotesque, etc. It's a pointed return to the purity of Greco-Roman architecture, to the purity of imitation of nature. So for Kant to come and say, well, this has no meaning, and it can be an example of free beauty, is very disingenuous. As moderns, we can, of course, tell ourselves, well, this has no meaning. But for contemporaries, I would claim that it has tremendous meaning. This desk was seen as a manifesto, really, of what the new interior design should be like. Kant's second example of free beauty, foliage for borders, Laubwerk zu Anfassungen, possess an equally distinguished pedigree. In monuments like the Areopagus in Rome, Augustan propagandists had used scrolls of acanthus leaves, a plant associated in antiquity with funerary rituals, to proclaim the rebirth of Rome after the troubled times of the Republic. So here's a sample from the Areopagus. The swirls of acanthus, which is one of the most common motifs in classical decor, is actually not, according to, we can interpret it against Kant by saying that it's very clearly based on funerary uses. And one of the stories that Vitruvius tells time and again about the Corinthian capital points that out. The invention of the Corinthian capital, according to Vitruvius, is this sculptor walking in the countryside and then finding the tomb of a maiden, on top of which were placed offerings. So a basket with fruit and other foods, and then a piece of stone on top of the basket to prevent the birds from eating the foodstuffs. And there was an acanthus plant that was planted underneath the basket that he didn't see. The person who placed the basket didn't see. And then suddenly the acanthus leaves grow. And then voila, it's a Corinthian capital. So this is exactly the type of stories that are crucial to buttress the idea of architecture rooted in nature. So here you see the relationship between acanthus leaves and funerary rituals in ancient Rome. And this is something that Kant is also completely removing from his discourse by saying that scrolls of acanthus leaves is meaningless. To become examples of Kantian disinterredness, frets and foliage scrolls needed to shed these earlier symbolic associations. As we have traced it, the history of ornament in architecture charted this process. Vitruvian ornamenta had been indissociable from the physical and symbolic role of religious structure since it designated the entablature, an essential component in the construction of temples. Rejecting its Vitruvian associations, modern interpreters of Alberti's ornamentum posited a complete separation between the appearance of a building and some more authentic beauty. They detached the latter, founded on proportional and geometrical operations, from a building's materiality, its ornamental manifestation. To secure disciplinary autonomy, 18th-century theorists ceased altogether to consider the orders and their moldings as ornamental. Academic authors such as Jean-François Bédard relegated ornament to sculptural enhancements that needed to be managed by decorum and verisimilitude. Other 18th-century voices, however, from peripheral domains that embraced grotesque compositional strategies, interiors, decorative arts, theater, painting, garden design, promoted a free ornamental practice, embracing non-Greco-Roman styles such as the Gothic. They advocated an expanded range of forms that soon claimed a stake in legitimate architecture. As Greek frets mingled with Chinese fretwork and acanthus scrolls combined with chicorée, the pejorative term used to describe Rococo foliage, ornament stripped of the social relevance it possessed in an architecture inspired by rhetoric, excited instead the privatized aesthetic delight of the modern beholder. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Questions? Yes? Yes.
Yes, yeah. I just have a question. You were talking about a Vitruvian, how they would see the ornaments as, like when looking at architecture, seeing the ornament as like the building itself. So what would they see the building as in that theory? Like how would Vitruvius see the building if it's just the
In
ornament?
Vitruvius, the ornament is the entablature. So it's a horizontal piece of the colonnade. So the columns are one thing, and the ornamentum is actually the entablature. So it's really designated as a piece of the building. So it's a completely different way of using the word. Now, what you're mentioning is more sort of the Albertian idea of ornament as physical or manifestation of the design. Am I understanding that?
Yeah.
So basically what Alberti says is that what's essential for beauty in a building is the lineamenta, that is the architect's idea of what the design should be. And that's based on geometric lines. But if it was only that, there would be no building. You cannot live in a series of geometric lines. So the ornament for Alberti then is the flesh around those lines. If the lines are not there, it will never be beautiful because the essence of beauty is based on mathematics. But if there's no ornament, you would never perceive the building because there would be no building. So that would be sort of the, from the Vitruvian vocabulary, then to the Renaissance Albertine model, and then to the modern model, our model, 18th-century model, where the ornament is just, you just can scratch it off, and it makes no difference. The only thing that you need to know, though, it's important for the social presentation of the building. If you don't include it, you might have problems of communication between the building and the users. So it's the idea that a palace for a king needs to be resplendent. Royal orders are Corinthian, the most ornamented. But if you had, say, a garrison or a fortified door, you would use Doric, you would use even Tuscan, very, very stripped down, because you need to express strength, not beauty, or not refinement.
So would you maybe say like that this integration between user and just building, I guess, is that what, like our identification of that, is that what makes us modern? Like to be able to distill that, or is it like,
well,
you understand?
what would happen if you take the modernity, say, in the post-representational politics, say the ideal of a traditional society is legibility. That's why ornament is used in clothing, for instance. The priest needs to be dressed in a specific way. So I can perceive social order and stratification through the visuals. For us now, that's completely gone. You don't, church designs, you could not, an 18th century viewer could not walk in New York City and see a 1960s church and say, this is a church. It doesn't look like a church. This is because of our emancipation as moderns. Basically, we can do what we want. In the past, the king is a king, his son is a king, etc. There's no movement between the orders. So in a way, modernity is destroying architecture as a social art, because it doesn't represent the world anymore the way it should be. On the other hand, it freed us, because architecture in that model of representation is a prison. There's no way you can design things any way you want. You have to work within a system. I'm being extremely sketchy, of course. It doesn't mean that because in traditional societies all the buildings would be exactly the same. But there's this incredible anxiety regarding the public speaking of the building. And that's not an anxiety that people have today. Architects are not that interested, I would claim, in having a building speak to the public.
But this is the memory with the culture as well.
Yes.
In reference to the cultural.
Yeah, and then of course what's gone entirely is the imitation of nature. There's no belief anymore that we imitate nature. So if you remove the imitation of nature as a ground of meaning, say if you don't believe that Callimachus actually sculpted that Corinthian capital from walking around seeing his tomb, then architectural forms are not justified anymore. So they're not rational anymore. Then it's grotesque. Then everything becomes this. And that, I would claim, is Zaha Hadid. That's contemporary designers would actually work like this, work into a system in which the ornament is taking over.
Right?
I think it's really interesting, especially when you talk about this idea of the facade being almost like, I'm almost thinking about it like the peel of a fruit. I mean, you have to have a consistency from the facade to the interior. And it's interesting, this conversation about sort of moderns versus 18th century thinkers, because I think there's also a really strong correspondence in what we may call sort of the modernist period. I mean, moving from the late 19th century to early 20th century. I work specifically on German design and architecture, and this concept of the facade having to speak for the interior is one that the German modernists are hugely interested in, and this German word Sachlichkeit really refers to that the exterior has to be legible, right, and it has to speak to what's going on in the interior, and there can't be a kind of lying between the outside and the inside. And I've dabbled, I'm teaching a class on ornament this semester here at BGC, and I'm not an 18th centuryist, so I've dabbled in that. But I was very interested to come across people like Blondel speaking in terms that seem very familiar to me as somebody who works on the modern period of this kind of idea of correspondence. And I'm wondering if that's something that you've come across in your work, or?
Yeah, that's a very interesting issue, because there's real consistency in architectural discourse in this idea of the truth of the building. The building should express what it does. Where it gets more complicated is because of modernism hatred for ornament, the mechanisms at play that an architect can use to make that external speak is relatively limited, in the case of the Bauhaus. In this case, the speaking works better because it's understood as a system. People understand that a dress that's very ornamented is for a princess. Our common vocabulary is actually completely shattered. We don't know that that building is actually a factory or a museum, etc. So the same idea of legibility occurs, but it's much more problematic in the 20th century in terms of how it functions. If it functions really, and this is the whole crisis of architecture. Do people understand modern architecture, etc.? In Blondel also, he's not a modernist in the sense that he says vraisemblance, verisimilitude, which means that it doesn't need to be completely transparent to itself. It can kind of do things, and one of the great examples is a Baroque palace will necessarily have a symmetrical facade that's composed, but behind, the rooms can be all different. Some of these windows are not even real windows, sometimes they're blocked. So how can that be? It's not the vérité of the facade does not correspond to the inside. But for Blondel, it would be vraisemblance. It looks regular, and that's what I need to do. And okay, this room has no windows, right? But that's not as important as having the facade speak as a regular thing. That's something the Bauhaus would never want.
Right.
The Bauhaus wants truth,
Yeah.
the Bauhaus, I guess what the Bauhaus would want ultimately is a glass box.
Yeah. Okay.
Something that's completely true.
But I think this question of the social function of form, right? And this question of what is, at a certain point, ornament sort of collapses into form, and form itself becomes ornamental. So you have these kind of gray areas of when you start pulling this apart.
Yeah, it's what Carson Harris has discussed, that the ornament becomes art.
Yeah.
So this,
Right.
the ornament's taking, the grotesque taking over, and now we live in it. But it's not understood as a system of vocabulary. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Can I press a little bit further on the idea of decorum and this legibility that Freya is talking about? The examples that you used, drawn from Rethinking, seem to be about, let's say, identifying the rank of an occupant of a building or the function of a building in the civic space through the degree of ornament. And then you mentioned the Vitruvian tradition, that there's something actually about the quality of the ornament or the proportions that also has a character that speaks more individually. And I was wondering how common you found attempts to actually intervene in the ornamental vocabulary with symbolic motifs like the rooster. I'm thinking of the Gallic order that was invented for Versailles and the Hall of Mirrors, or specific ways of making the ornament speak not just in its richness or relative degrees of richness or poverty, but actually something kind of semiotic in it that says, this is a theater, so we expect to see tragic and comic masks occupying the place of the ovalo molding, or something like that. Is that how common is that gesture?
I think Blondet would claim that these are cheap tricks that only a sculptor can do, or should do. The architect should not be concerned only by putting, say, liars on a theater, or horses, or the roosters at the Galerie des Glaces. That's, I guess what he would claim is that it works as vraisemblance because it does function really well as a communication tool. But it's kind of a dirty secret in a way. It's not really what architects should be doing. And in many ways, in Ledoux, in 18th century architects, then the building itself becomes that. It becomes the giant symbol in itself. Right?
Thinking of the cow shed.
The cow shed, or the famous penis-shaped building that Ledoux does. So, what Blondet is trying to do, I think, is trying to restrict that sort of trick. Let's not write on buildings theater. Let not, a Greek temple that doesn't say temple to Jupiter on it.
But it might have in the pediment a sculpture that would indicate that. And obviously, sculpture, architectural sculpture is a place where the specificity of meaning can come out.
But I think Blondet would try to say, don't focus on that too much. That's the province of the sculptors.
So I know you're talking about facades, but what about something like the Café Militaire of Ledoux, where there is this idea of the boiserie is actually, it's a forest with weapons that have been hung up. That seems to be kind of between the two. Is it sculpture? Is it architecture? What's I know that's interior, so not
that's probably the domain, the freedom that I mentioned in stage sets, for instance. Fireworks, interior decors, and that's a very outlandish decor, which is more, I think, like theater than it is within the tradition of, say, 18th century interior decoration, as you know.
So permissible within, but not as a billboard for the building.
Yeah, I think those are peripheral, at least to the concerns, to Blondet's concerns, who's trying to kind of maintain the edifice in one piece. Obviously, you could say that this is much more successful socially because it's the Café Militaire. But then we start living in the theater. We're not living in what Blondet thinks architecture should be. That's also probably our predicament as moderns. We live in theater. Yeah, and it forms.
I really appreciate your focusing our attention on this present but so often overlooked, part of our experience of space. Thank you.
I really appreciated your discussion of Kant's misunderstanding of ornament. And if I remember my pro-seminar well, Kant never left home, right? What were his sources for his understanding of it or misunderstanding of it? Was it prints? Was it the world around him?
I'm being very unfair with Kant. First of all, I'm not a philosopher, so I should not dabble with Kant at all. But I think when he touches on those ornamental things, it should ring bells. It's like, well, not really. He's an extremely learned man, and he didn't leave Königsberg, but he certainly knew about the debates, our debates. It's very interesting to me that they seem to be an incredible blind spot, and you realize that he's a modern because he doesn't understand that a fret is not just a pattern; it actually means something. And so he's like us. I was playing when we see frets outside in New York, we don't say ancient Greece, ancients against moderns, reform of decorative arts in the 18th century, all the stuff that comes out.
I guess the question about that is a question about the kind of universality of that meaning for the general public. And if Kant really ignores that, is Kant so divorced from I mean, okay, current experiment, but like, or is he so, I mean, how is that the threat would communicate to sort of the general audience and it missed Kant? I mean, I feel like I'm
Oh,
not
yeah.
quite
No,
understanding.
I'm oversimplifying, obviously. In the system, in Godin's ideal system of transparency, everybody would be completely aware theoretically of every form, which of course doesn't work. So they would understand that a fret is actually a Greek pattern. Kant's modernity is that basically what interests him in the fret is just the geometric plane. So it would be, I guess, for somebody who doesn't speak Arabic to look at decorative writing on the walls of mosques and just see patterns. So there's sort of a delaminating of the depth of that, and becomes really much more about the play. So in a way, it's grotesque. Kant's much more interested in the beauty of this as a shade, but this shade means nothing. But then the beauty of it makes us, if you blow this in scale, then it becomes a work of art in itself, because it's abstract.
Right.
So it's
There's
beyond
also the complication with Kant of the appeal of the functional object.
That's right, because
So
it's
there's
at
another
the
way
ear,
of-
you know. I mean, as you know, the theory is that the beauty cannot be related to a function. It has to be free. So what's free? This cannot be a beautiful chair because it's a chair. But what about that? That's free. You don't need to have a curve in the chair.
Other questions? So this is not my area at all, but you mentioned patrons, and I was just wondering if there are any instances that you know of, say in the 18th century, of issues between a patron and an architect in terms of the construction of a building or the appearance of a building, or because clearly the architect is working for the patron and
All the time.
and who
Architects-
usually wins out?
The patron. Architects work for people. Architects are not free artists. And certainly that's where Blondin says that custom is so important, because custom is all the daily stuff that you need to deal with. If the client wants to have a Corinthian and he shouldn't, he's going to get it. So I mean, the edifice of the cool looks this kind of beautiful and super clear and transparent, but ultimately the reality is much more dirty. The way that the orders
And-
never correspond to anything.
Do we have documentation where you kind of see that playing out?
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, clearly. I mean, some patrons have incredibly precise ideas of what they want, especially in interior decoration. There's the famous quote, the famous quote that a grotesque painter would sketch something and leave a hole so that the patron can actually participate to the grotesque composition. It's kind of a play.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jean-François.